fascinating.
Well done.
And at the end of your book, you write, "Let's get started," or similar. So I'll quote you and say, "Let's get started." I don't have to introduce Stephen. He was the number 346 Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, and I think the only foreign national
Until my successor.
Until
so I didn't mess up too much, or they would have not picked another non-UK national. But yes. And in fact, my successor is, I think, the first person who didn't have a Cambridge degree.
Is it true?
So that's yeah. So I don't think they could have gone with me if I hadn't done my PhD at Cambridge. I don't think.
Not only Cambridge. That brings us to the next point. It's not only Cambridge but Trinity College, and I mean all of you are Cambridge except for you. Or Oxford. No problem. It's never too late. But Cambridge University has, like, I forgot, 32, you will know it, the precise number. I think 32 colleges, and Trinity is by far the best and biggest. That's and Stephen and myself did our PhDs at Trinity, and here there are maybe half of us are alumni of Trinity College. And except for Ian, who is from Trinity Hall, which is right next door. We have a special guest tonight here, which is who is Mr. Kazumi Nishikawa, and we are very, very honored that you can find time, because I think you are one of the most busy people in Japan overall, and Mr. Nishikawa is responsible. He's heading the Department for Strategic Industries and Future Developments at the Future Strategic Industries of Japan. So he kindly offered, like 3 days ago, he have found an empty space in his diary. So he offered to give us a talk afterwards about
my honor. Thank you.
Future industries. So. And I hope we find some time for discussion as well. So let's get started. And we agreed with your people that we'll have a conversation. So I thought I've prepared some questions which I sent to you. So I thought we'll start with some questions. And then afterwards we'll have open discussion, and then there's Mr. Nishikawa, and then afterwards we'll have dinner. And no alcohol during the serious part, if that's okay.
Very wise, at least for me.
We will not have sherry based on seminar tradition.
Okay, so first of all I wanted to congratulate you to this profound and fantastic book. I read it end to end, it's amazing. It starts with it's like building a cathedral, and ends, for how we can use the system of law to make our society more stable. And it's a wonderful book. Those who haven't read it, please read it. In one of the reviewers of the book said that many other presidents of universities will probably be angry with you, because most of them are so busy being president of universities that they don't have the time to write a book as well in parallel. Whereas Stephen, he was president of Cambridge, or Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University. In parallel, he wrote this book also.
But only because of COVID, to be clear. It would not have happened without COVID.
Oh, you could have managed.
No, I don't think so. Because it's important to say that, because I don't want people to think that Vice Chancellor is a part-time job. It really is not. But in fact, it's an all-consuming job. But what I discovered, my family was all back in Canada, so I was on my own. And all of a sudden there were no dinners at night, and there was no travel. And so that's why I thought, all right, this is the moment to try to save my sanity by actually producing something that was, for me, stimulating. But it couldn't have happened without COVID. So it's the one positive for me that I can speak to about COVID.
So one of the things I found so interesting, no problem. One of the things you repeatedly refer to is how important it is not just to have words, but also actions. And then also you emphasize the importance of you call it, you use different words in different locations, but it's something like practicing communities or communities of practice. So, which, for example, in the case of law, you say law is really interacts and in kind of feeds back with communities of practice. So maybe our society here on the back of Trinity College and Cambridge University is also one of these communities of practice. So maybe what we do tonight is part of what you say is so important. So thank you all for participating and being active here. And in the case of Trinity College, Trinity in Japan, we built over 10 years. So we are a community we built over 10 years. And Trinity College is built over 700 years. And Cambridge University, I think 850 now or so. So there's a long tradition, which is very important. Now I come to some questions. You mentioned 3 anxieties. And at some point, I think these are all societies coming from, anxieties coming from the society. No? So you mentioned populist nationalism, fear of global, and then technology, AI, SNS are our technologies.
And the domination of that space by big tech. I think that's
Yes.
related. It's not just the technologies, but also the sheer power of corporate interests.
And in some cases, one single person dominating
Yes.
in some cases, or in many cases. Now, when I was reading that, what I thought is some of these anxieties are locally, depend on the locale. So, for example, and some of the anxieties, I think, come from nature. And then in addition today, you have war. And these anxieties go probably on top of the society issues. No? And now, in the case of war, Japan has 3 very difficult neighbors, which you as a government has a lot to do with. And we all have some anxiety from what our neighbors here are doing. And Canada has less problems with neighbors, but of course there's also the Arctic issues and so on. So the second point I have here is that in addition to that, you say there are unknown unknowns, which are, you could differentiate between risk and uncertainty.
Yes.
And in the case of risk, you say that can be calculated or estimated, and uncertainties are like black swan type events. And my issue here is that in addition to that, could we add unspeakables to that? And my thinking here is that you mentioned in great detail, you mentioned the COVID situation. And you mentioned about, I think, 20 or 30 questions, which are all profound and important and detailed.
And all were designed to suggest that the questions at various points in COVID were actually unanswerable, even with the best science. And that was trying to emphasize this unknowable quality, different from simply a calculation of risk.
Oh, okay. And now my question to you here is, how much of that is local, and how much, you mentioned local as one of the, globalization as one of the anxiety issues. Now we are in Japan, you've written the book in Cambridge, so I was thinking maybe there's a positive aspect by putting using globalization, for example, by looking at how Japan has done in COVID. And I'm sure you know the numbers, I just repeat them here, but the death rate in UK was about 5 to 6 times higher than in Japan. So Japan did much better in COVID in terms of death rates, excess deaths, than UK did. Now, that I was looking at that many times on the internet, and Cambridge is full of clever people, so I'm sure somebody in Cambridge must have had the idea of looking up on the internet what the death rate is, and I've never seen any headlines Now in England, this was COVID was mixed up with Brexit and nationalism.
Exactly.
So that's my question here.
So that's a lot of questions, actually, and they're good questions. A couple of observations. First, in the book, I try to be very clear that I think that one of the sort of existential anxieties that we face globally is climate change. But I choose not to address that because I think it's very widely addressed by others and very well. And I give some examples of good thinking around the anxiety generated by climate change and other environmental issues. To your point about nature being a factor is very important. But I bracket it, not because it's not important, but because I think it's dealt with. Dealt with conceptually. We haven't dealt with the problem. So the three elements that I highlighted, I wanted to try to trace out aspects that I thought could actually be present everywhere to different degrees. So I try to make the claim that populist nationalism in various forms, fear of the global, and I'll come back to that, and this anxiety around new technologies and domination by big tech are shaping global conversations. I want to be really clear, though, partly what I'm saying about the global is not that I think that all global phenomena are negative. I don't think that at all. In fact, I think what's happened is a kind of retrenchment from many positive aspects of globalism. I won't call it globalization, but globalism. And I think that's partly related to the first phenomenon, which is populist nationalism, but it's also related to, and I try to trace this out in the book, not unreasonable fears that economic and societal disruptions are taking place because of global interactions that are not being well managed. And then I went back, of course, to the 2008-9 financial crisis and the fact, I think, that we haven't really even now fully processed what happened at that moment, or set of moments. And I think we're still seeing anxieties around housing costs, anxieties around job losses, which of course also relate to the third factor, changing technologies. All of these, what I tried to create is a sense of this embedded nervousness in society that politics is having trouble dealing with. However, you're absolutely right that of course superimposed on that are also localized concerns. I don't think anymore that the war concerns are so local. I think what's happened now in the Middle East, which of course has all happened after the book, it is a fast-changing world. I mean, the immediate events, not the history of the conflict in the Middle East. But I think that's now becoming a global worry, not quite at the level of nervousness around nuclear risk that existed when I was growing up, but starting to emerge. And then you're absolutely right that locally in Japan, I visited Taiwan recently, there's a real sense of specific risk associated with the local geopolitical circumstances. And that's placed on top of what I try to describe. I do want to be clear, though, I describe this not for the purpose of making everyone depressed, because I don't think that's a particularly helpful way of imagining the world. What I'm trying to argue in the book is that this basis of anxiety needs actually to be actively addressed, and that there are mechanisms in society that can help us address them. And what I try to do is go back and sort of almost resurrect or retrieve some patterns of thought that have actually proven to help societies generate resilience over time. And one of them, and it is only one, is a conceptualization of the rule of law that I then trace out for the final 2/3 of the book. It's a very particular conceptualization of the rule of law, but I try to argue that if we could capture that conceptualization and embed it in actual practices of our societies, then we'd have a chance to address some of these global anxieties. On COVID, I said earlier that one of the only things that was positive for me was actually getting to write the book. interestingly, I was just commenting the other day, I was visiting a hospital. The only other thing that was actually a positive for me during COVID was the experience of working much more collaboratively between the university and the local hospitals and the researchers who were, really being heroic in getting out, going into the labs, even when all the rest of the labs were closed down, to really work on trying to address the COVID crisis through monitoring, through development of vaccines, et cetera, And it was really interesting to me how just that sense of crisis did galvanize collaboration in the way that I try to describe in the book. And partly my desire in creating, in the first part, a sense of crisis is to say, we can use this. It's the old saw that every crisis is an opportunity. It is true. Every crisis is an opportunity if we seize it, and if we draw on the exciting, I think, intellectual heritage that we have to try to effectively address. Sorry, long answer to your setup question, but that's what the book is trying to achieve.
Fantastic, thank you so much. My next point is also selective. It's you emphasize a lot that the legal system, if it all works, contributes to stability of society.
Yes.
Whereas on the opposite side, you have revolution, and you argue that revolutions often end in blood and
It's his children. Yes.
It's his children.
Right.
So that's not so good. No? But in other, I gave you some examples where actually change might be for the better. And as one of the examples, I can mention two examples. One example would be the Ukraine war, where I quoted to you an article by a researcher called James Nixie at the Chatham House in London, who, he's not the only one having this opinion. And he said that the leaders in the Western world, they prefer kind of a continuation of the status quo as opposed to Ukraine winning and for them unpredictable events could happen in Russia. So they prefer to have a never-ending war instead of Ukraine winning outright. And they use this phrase where they say we will support Ukraine as long as it takes, but they don't say where that should lead to.
Right.
And another example would be Margaret Thatcher is known to have preferred Germany, West and East Germany, to remain separate. And in Japan, there is another case which the ladies here will be able to attest to. Maybe you know that Japan has a family law which was written in 1885 or something and has almost never changed. And that family law sets down an ideal family with the grandparents and the parents and the children and no unmarried children, and the women giving up their name and sacrificing their name for the sake of the husband. And so it can be the other way around, but in 98% of the cases. And I do know that some of the ladies around here, every Japanese professional ladies has problems with that, except for those who marry foreigners, because that does not apply for foreigners. So, and now Keida and Ren, which is one of the industry associations, they say, please change this law. It's so terrible for women who are company owners or lawyers or investment bankers that halfway through the career they are forced by law to change their name, more or less. So, but it's so hard to change that. So my question here is, law, the system of law, you argue it's for stability, but of course also in some cases change is a good thing.
Sure.
Not just a revolution, but
I'm trying to argue something slightly different in the book. What I'm suggesting is that law is an effective mediator of stability and change. So it is absolutely not meant to be an argument for a conservatism in all cases. In fact, what I'm trying to suggest is that many people think of law as an essentially conservative force because it's associated with rules and order rather than revolution. And I'm trying to argue that we romanticize revolution, but very often revolution is profoundly damaging to societies, and it takes a very, very long time for societies to recover from revolutions, and they don't always recover. I would say Russia has not fully recovered from the 1918 revolution, even today. So what I'm trying to suggest is law is not conservative, but it does tend to encourage stability in the sense of non-revolutionary change. So I think it helps to mediate between the desire for important change in society by giving a structure for that to happen. And that's where I talk about communities of practice, because I think the communities of practice allow us to shape shared understandings of where we want society to go. And then law becomes a mechanism, and I'll come back to that, it becomes a mechanism that then allows that change to take place in structured ways that prevent societal disintegration. So I actually think that law can be a profound force for healthy change. The point I would emphasize as well is that the way I've described it, one could reach a conclusion that law is nothing more than an instrument. It is just a thing that you use to accomplish an end. And it's a central argument in the book that law is more than that. That law, because of its ability to shape change and stability, is itself a force within society that isn't just an instrument at the whim of other actors. So you can't just say, oh, well, I want to accomplish goal A, and I'm just going to use law, and it doesn't matter how I use it. It doesn't matter whether I'm misusing it, because I'm accomplishing the end that I want to accomplish. So in the book, I give very detailed examples. One, the international law around torture, to say that there are things that have to be complied with within the processes of law that give it its power. And that when we abandon those processes, law can become dysfunctional and law can actually become a perversion. And that's exactly what we saw at the time of the Second World War. First with the Nazi regime, and honestly, of course, also here with the regime of militarism that used law to control, but didn't think of law as an instrument for social stability. It was simply an instrument of oppressive control. And that's what I'm trying to argue against in the book.
Slavery would be another example.
Slavery is an excellent example, exactly. Slavery would be a great example. There are many sort of human rights issues that would serve as great examples.
You know Michael Banner, who is...
I do know Michael. In fact, he and I used to talk about this a lot when I was at Cambridge.
Oh, really? Michael Banner, he's Dean of College?
Dean of the Chapel.
At Trinity College, and last few years he has been studying a lot, doing research about slavery in England. And he wrote a book now, and he's very strongly in favor of reparations.
Of reparations, yes, yeah.
And
it's a very complicated topic. But
yeah, he was mentioning he gets death threats because of his work.
Yes.
So maybe the last question from my side would be, what's it like to be Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University? That is a very
big
unique
job.
So.
Well, it's a unique honor, and that is where I would have to start. It's a remarkable honor. You mentioned that the university is more than 800 years old. And so when I was first asked to consider taking on the role, it was somewhat daunting, as you can imagine, but the only way that I could process it was to recognize that I could not be anything other than a trustee, that this was a great institution with enormous success, also huge challenges, and many things that needed to be addressed, but that it was a fundamentally important institution, not only in UK society, but frankly in global society. And so I never imagined that, one walks in and fixes the university. And I'm not saying there weren't things that needed to be addressed. There were. And we tried to address that, I and colleagues. But I always remembered that this was a fundamentally sound and important institution. And above all, it was like the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Try not to do anything that would actually damage the resilience and the way forward of the university. And that also was liberating, because on any given issue, you can, of course. So I'll step back to say I read a book when I first became a university president at the University of British Columbia in Canada many, many years ago. And the book set out the theory that the people who have the longest term interest in a university are the members of the governing council, whatever that is, the board or the trustees. The people who have the least long-term interest, but that doesn't mean they're not important, are the students, for obvious reasons. They're there for a short time. The people who had the second least longevity in their reasonable interest are the administrators, because they think they've got to go in and fix things within the tenure that they have as administrators. And the people with the second longest interest are the faculty members, who have this long-term commitment in many cases to the institution. I found that a very chastening read, because it made me remember that as I was going in to try to address a particular challenge that I felt the university had to fix or manage, I had to remember that there were other people who had long-term interests in the place who might have different opinions. And that was always a really helpful reminder that just because I had an important role, it was an important role for a limited period of time, and I could do certain things and try to do as much as I could to make the place stronger, but that it wasn't up to me to be the embodiment of Cambridge University, because it was far bigger than I was. So all of that to say, it was actually a tremendously rewarding experience. You can imagine the brilliance of colleagues that I got to work with day in and day out. It was so a great honor to travel around the university. I used to go every week. I made it a religious activity to make sure I went to a department to meet with students, to meet with faculty members, to see what research was going on. And almost everywhere I went, someone was a Nobel laureate, or someone was a Commonwealth scholar that I was meeting, or someone was a very distinguished visitor from another part of the world. And it was so energizing to just realize that I had the privilege of being the Vice-Chancellor for this extraordinary institution. And of course, the colleges are very much a part of that. And I was very proud and am proud to be a graduate of Trinity. But it was also fabulous to be able to go and see the different colleges with their different traditions. People think of Cambridge as being somewhat monolithic in some ways, but it really isn't. There are tremendous differences in different parts of the university, in the departments and in the colleges, and that again was fascinating. The last thing I'll say was two things very quickly. Fabulous to engage with the students. I mean, it was so inspiring to meet students again from all over the world who were among the very best at what they were trying to learn anywhere. That's tremendous. The other thing that was remarkable was the access that one had as Vice Chancellor in traveling the world. When I went to China, I would meet the Premier of China. Like, that's pretty unusual for anyone. And when I went to India, I was entertained by the President, met the Prime Minister, and leaders of industry and leaders of the academic world everywhere that one went. And that wasn't because of me, that was because I represented Cambridge University. So a tremendous honor and a great privilege, and many times a lot of fun. I will say that given what's happened in the world since I stepped down, I would say that it was slightly easier to be Vice Chancellor when I was Vice Chancellor than it is right now. It hasn't been quite as hard in the UK as in some of our institutions in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. But the pressures that my colleague university leaders are now feeling are really intense. And I felt them to some extent. I can't pretend I didn't. But I think they're escalating, and I worry about that because I do think it's becoming a job that is actually quite unattractive in many ways. And I know in the United States, there's a real fear that there will be many very good people who wouldn't in 1,000 years consider being a university president right now.
Thank you so much. So maybe we have about 20 minutes for general discussion if there are questions. You were first and Ian second. Is that okay?
You said before when you were growing up you felt anxiety over the nuclear war was probably higher than that. So was society as a whole more anxious, less anxious back then about what dealing with it? Or?
It's a very interesting question, and I think it's complicated as all of these things are. For one thing, I do think we have to accept that there is a greater willingness to express anxiety in society today and in individuals. And that is, generally, I would say, a positive thing. I think people are more willing to be honest about how they feel and the pressures that they feel in their environment, etc. So it's a little hard to compare for that reason. It's very interesting when you look back. I don't know how many of you might have seen. There were lots of newsreels and things during the 50s and 60s. I mean, I was little. I grew up really in the 70s, but I was born right at the end of the 1950s, I'm embarrassed to say. And when you look back at the newsreels or films of the time, the idea that there really was going to be a thermonuclear conflagration was very real. It's funny, where I grew up, just down the street, there was a huge tower with a speaker, which was a part of an early warning system all across Canada in the case of nuclear missiles coming over the Arctic. I mean, not that you could have done anything. And then, the building of all of the bomb shelters and that sort of thing. So I think there was a genuine anxiety, but it was highly targeted. And interestingly, partly because of that, with the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, it strangely became a manageable anxiety. And I think what may be different today is the conflagration almost of interlocked anxieties, all of which feel less manageable. People feel that the world is more out of control, I think, even than in the time of what I was describing in the 1950s and 60s. And so that kind of anxiety, sort of free-floating, how do you get your hands around it? The notion of deep uncertainty as opposed to risk. I think that's perhaps a new phenomenon, and then people are expressing it more publicly.
Okay, so late 19th century, Industrial Revolution, technology, it was its own form of technological disruption.
Oh, very much so.
Excesses in society, pronounced wealth inequality, early 20th century, culminates, I don't think it directly leads to, but definitely culminates in the Second World War. Post-war, in the mid-20th century, establishment of a rules-based international order, Bretton Woods framework, ICJ was founded in 1945, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, I think was 2000. So we had a legal framework. So that's kind of point number one. Fast forward pretty much 100 years, late 20th century, internet revolution, which has now kind of led into AI. Early 21st century, the global financial crisis, which clearly resulted from excesses in society. We've seen extreme wealth inequality. On the back of that, we've seen a wave of populism. And again, not necessarily the populism that has translated into war, but we've seen the emergence of autocrats who have ridden that wave of populism that has ultimately translated into war. And so in the span of 100 years, we're kind of seeing patterns repeat itself. So my question, if you accept that as a very high-level background or premise, is to what extent do you think history is repeating itself? What's different this time? And is there anything instructive about the past the application of law that we can kind of learn from, such that the application of law can benefit society today?
A wonderful question. So just on the premise, I think I largely agree with the description. I think what's intriguing today is that, and it goes back to almost part of the answer to the first question, it's the interlocking forces that seem potentially more complicated. I think if you go back and you look at the late 19th century, post-Bismarck, and the evolution of the nation state as the profoundly seemingly immutable structure of global order, that actually created a certain degree of predictability in the system, because you knew who the main actors were. So one of the nuance to your description is that there are many more actors who have global resonance than was probably true at the end of the 19th century right into the First World War. And by that I mean actors like Hamas or Hezbollah or cartels in Latin America, or other forms of societal organization that have violence as an expression of their ideology and their dreams. And I think that has really complicated international relations. So that's just another layer of complexity in the situation. And it probably means that the analysis can't be exactly drawn from the historical parallels. Having said that, the other thing that I struggled with in writing the book, and I really struggled with it, and I talk about it at the beginning, was that I became fascinated, perhaps not surprisingly, with the lead up to the Second World War and the Second World War itself, because these were times of tremendous uncertainty, not just risk. And one struggles to try to assess whether or not the Weimar Republic is a parallel that we should look at and draw upon. So the Weimar Republic, for those who haven't read history or whatnot, was another time of tremendous societal change. The new technologies were all having an impact. There was in the same way there was in the early 2000s, just this enormous eruption of wealth, greater concentration of wealth, but also a kind of excitement in the society, a cultural richness. So all of those things happening at once, and the whole thing felt very unstable, and was very unstable and complicated. You should read a book called Paris 1919, if any of you want to focus on some of these questions, by a historian named Margaret Macmillan. Fabulous book, Paris 1919. Because what was argued was that there was a kind of direct trajectory from what happened at the end of the Second World War and the Treaty of Versailles into the failure of the German economy, into the collapse of employment, into the rise of fascism, into the Second World War. So you draw the trajectory. Paris 1919 questions that, questions whether in fact Germany was as repressed in the agreement as it made out to be. All of that to say, it strikes me that there are, of course, historic parallels, but none of them is perfect. So I don't think you can say, we know that the way out of this is to create a new League of Nations, or the way out of this is to reform the subsequent United Nations, or the way out of this is to get a new Bretton Woods Compact. And the reason I say that is I think they're all unattainable. I don't think we could do any of those things, and that's perhaps a sad reflection on our society, but it is more disjointed. There are fewer loci of real power. There is no monolithic power that the United States represented, for example, after the Second World War. And you don't have to talk about decay. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe it's the end of the Roman Empire. I don't know. But it is certainly not the world's dominating power. And nor is it a bilateral situation that we imagined in the Cold War era. We just have a lot more actors. You can comment on this from your international relations degree. But there are many, many more actors who have power. Turkey, India, obviously China, but Russia in its own strange way, etc., and Nigeria. So plus all of the non-state actors that I talked about. So I'm sorry, very long answer to your question, but I think the long and the short of it is, of course we have to try to look for ideas from the past, but I don't think that we can look for a solution from the past. I think we have to invent that solution drawing on our rich intellectual traditions, and that's actually what the book's trying to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe Nishikawa-san, if you have a question.
Very interesting about the historian things. What you said, that to take the ideas from the past, but we have to not to localize. We have to revise in accordance with the current situations. Actually, that's just my comment to the 100 years ago, the UK, France, and Germany had a lot of economic war
Yes.
between them. The one example is that UK is trying to stop the export of manganese, the critical minerals from Brazil to Germany.
Right.
This famous story. But currently, China is trying to utilize critical minerals, weaponize it to make an economic coercion to the world.
Absolutely.
So the world seems to be very resemblable. But just as you pointed out, the situation is of course different from the 100 years ago. So therefore, I am very keen, to learn from idea,
Right.
To find some kind of ideas from the past. So therefore, the historian way of thinking, or the historian seems very important for these fluctuated situations. How you think about such kind of trend?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's funny, I started life as an historian.
Yeah.
That was my undergraduate degree, history and literature. And I got into law really through history. And so as I was writing this book, it reminded me that that's actually my own entry point. And I don't want to personalize it too much, but I really do think that it's worthwhile trying to tease out where we've been, because we don't have to invent everything anew. And I think it's one of the scary things. If you imagine that you are sort of alone in a dark universe and that we have to invent everything, I think that's a profoundly destabilizing idea. And that's why we are not controlled by the past. I absolutely don't believe that. I don't think there's an inevitability, but I do think there are resources that can actually help us. And what I've tried to do in the book is tease out the legal resources. And there are others, and that's a point I make. Law is not the answer, but it is part of a set of approaches that, if we draw on these grand traditions, could give us some comfort at a time of high anxiety. I think he was trying to, yes.
Okay, and then I think we go to
No,
you.
please.
We'll have two more questions and then Yoto.
So I'm very curious, when we think about a phrase like rule of law, and I think there are different components to this.
Yes.
There's institutions, courts or supranational institutions, that kind of stuff. There's a certain codification, a legal framework that constitutions or whatever present. And then there's two other groups that I'm thinking about, which are practitioners, legal practitioners.
Yes.
And there's me as a consumer. I'm just curious about those last two groups, because probably when you think about your conception of how the rule of law can change and contribute, probably something needs to change in legal practitioners.
Yep.
How they're sourced, or the way they think, or what they do, because as you were hinting at earlier, there are situations where they can apply their ingenuity to quite dark situations, should we say. And for example, myself as a consumer, I think about lawyers as solving a particular problem that I've got.
Right.
But probably in your thinking, actually, I need to reconceive what a lawyer is, and maybe I'd ask you to comment on those two things.
Yes, and it's the last chapter of the book, actually. I think some profound wrong turns have been taken in the evolution of the legal profession in the 20th century, probably epitomized by billable hours, because I think it turned law into a commodity rather than a set of relationships. And I think it encouraged the idea that I tried to address a little bit earlier, that law is nothing other than an instrument to achieve specific ends, so to solve your problem. And I do think that law is about solving problems, of course it is, but it doesn't do that in a kind of ethical vacuum. And I think it's really important, and what I try to argue in the book is lawyers have to recapture what was a historic tradition in the law of being I won't say wise people because that may presume too much, but well-educated, well-informed, thoughtful people exercising judgment in the light of experience. And that's what lawyers have historically been. And so it used to be the case that people saw a lawyer as a kind of advisor, not as someone who just came in and told you what you can do and what you can't do in a kind of totally transactional way. And so I don't want to romanticize this. I'm not saying it was perfect in an earlier period, but I do think moving away from the idea that we're kind of hired guns, and especially, how many times have you heard that lawyer's a pain because he gets in the way or doesn't help us get to where we need to go. Now, that doesn't diminish the creativity of law. I think law is an immensely creative discipline, but it's about the exercise of prudential judgment in the light of experience. And it does mean that I think the so-called consumer has to think a little bit differently about that relationship because it isn't purely transactional. And again, I don't want to idealize this. Of course, there's still going to be money exchanged, and you're still being hired to give that advice, but the framing of it is somewhat different. And the last point I would make is, and I try to emphasize this, the communities of practice that I talk about are not just practice in a legal sense.
Yes.
They're communities of people striving to find a way forward in society, and lawyers are part of those communities of practice, but so too are many others who are contributing to the formation of law through the community of practice, even if they're not practicing lawyers.
Thank you.
So, last question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is about some global issues, and I believe that some of the global issues you mentioned, like pandemic or AI, or in my area of engineering biology,
Yes.
these questions need more interdisciplinary approaches because from technology angles and morality, and quite often we see some of the, in order to make a proper judgment about make a sound decision, you will need both the deeper technological understanding and also quite a different moral or ethical perspective. So in that sense, democratic or problem solving or judgment may become more and more complicated and difficult.
Yes.
But given that you have been a Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and if you look at the tertiary education in academic institutions or even secondary education, and also lifetime on-the-job training and education, what should be the sort of right balance of having a broad set of liberal arts type of knowledge and standpoint of viewpoint, and keep updating your specialized knowledge so that people have a sound discussion rather than emotional discussion, or to keep approach different problems from different angles, and deliberation is a balanced solid part.
That deserves another hour, but I'll give it 2 minutes because we want to
In
hear
theory,
from.
we have an hour.
No, we don't.
And it's also related to economic security.
It is. just 3 points. The reason I'm in the job that I'm in now is because I agree with you 100% in your description of the challenges we face. My current role is in an organization that seeks to bridge amongst disciplines. We bring together interdisciplinary teams at a global level to look at some of the most profound challenges facing science and humanity. Artificial intelligence is a key element, but synthetic biology, engineering biology is another. I think it's absolutely crucial in our world today that we do a better job at that. I also think, second point, it's crucial that we have people in government with more scientific knowledge and more engineering knowledge. This is a profound gap, I think, in many, many countries. Not all, but many, including my own, where there are very few people in the public service who have the capacity to actually think with others in the sciences and engineering and maths. And so all of the questions around regulation, for example, of AI or synthetic biology, are really profoundly confused because, frankly, people don't understand what's going on. So that's the third point. The last point, to answer your question, is, and I couldn't have said this while I was Vice-Chancellor, so I will now reveal, I think it is profoundly important that we have broader education than is often the case at the secondary level. I'm not a fan of the UK system, for example. I think it's too narrow, and I would really, and I'm not advocating for so-called liberal arts. That also can become a watered-down version of nothing. I think some degree of depth is important, but not to the exclusion of all other influences. So finding that balance is hard, but not unachievable.
Thank you. This was really, really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One thing I thought I forgot at the beginning, if we spend just maybe 20 seconds each to introduce each other, if you like, so that Stephen had I sent you the list, but all of us will not know each other. So maybe just very short, no big speeches, please. Let's start here and just go on. Yeah.
So, and my name is Professor Toope. I'm from Japan, obviously. Took an MBA back in 2015. And now founded my company in Japan and Luxembourg about plastic chemical recycling for carbon capture. Very nice to meet you.
Great.
Nikki?
Because yes, I am one of the rare cases taking a lot of time in progress. So I did mathematics with computer science, moved to Japan about 5 years ago. I've been a freelance computer programmer. The next thing right now, so that makes sense.
Hi, I'm Jason. I just graduated from Trinity last year, and I studied engineering for 4 years, and I'm currently working at a defense company in special projects, which I can't speak.
Yes, interesting.
Hi, I'm Sato Koniya. I did my undergrad at Kyoto University Law, and then I became a lawyer at the firm called Moihama and Matsumoto. And then I went to Cambridge, did LLM at Wilson College. And then in 2015 I quit. Well, I'm still registered, so I'm now working in a private equity called Integral. I'm a partner there.
Great.
Very nice to meet you.
Ian Drayton. I graduated in the mid-90s from Trinity Hall in Japanese. I have been in finance my entire career. I run banking for Goldman Sachs in Asia ex-Japan, lived in Tokyo 98 to 2010, and since 2010 in Hong Kong.
My name is Nishikawa from Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industries. I jumped in this, the Cambridge communities, but I graduated from the University of Tokyo, Faculty of Law, and I ran the law school in the Georgetown, Washington DC. I'm a U.S. lawyer, but I have worked in the Japanese government roughly 30 years. and especially now focusing on the economic security as well as the emerging technology. Thank you.
Yuji Suzuki and Oriental Studies Center Conference 2006 matriculation. And I started my career as a diplomat and worked in free trade agreements for law. But now I switched my career and lead a company startup for the engineering biology.
Hi, Miyamoto. I graduated in 2009 to obtain an MBA degree. And right after Cambridge, I worked at KMG. Then quit it for a couple. Then I'm running my own consulting firm. Thank you.
My name is Fujiko Amano. Actually, I'm a friend of Dora Houston and colleague with Mr. Nishikawa, and also former colleague with But I used to work for Ministry of Foreign Affairs and now with the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industries. And I actually did BA in jurisprudence at Oxford, which is the other place. So thank you very much for your invitation and very exciting discussion today.
Hello, I'm Ken. I matriculated in 2013 at Darwin College. Then I did my master's in business administration at Judge Business School. But my first career was at the Ministry of Finance, and I worked for Ministry of Justice as well. And I switched to private sector, so I'm quite interested in the intersection of private and public, and also business and private, public. So very interesting book. Thank you very much.
Peter?
Peter Kilner. I matriculated Trinity in 1982, I think it was, natural sciences. But I spent my career as a lawyer, partner in one of the international law firms, but retired about 7 years ago, living in Japan.
Hi, I'm Go Masuda. I studied in Cambridge, MBA, almost 16 years ago at Houston. And I spent most of the half of my career in financial sector. About 6 years ago, I left the company and running my own independent advisory firm. And I'm currently assisting some global tech startup company, including some UK one and another one, the Singapore one, and assisting the global innovative company to enter into Japan. Thank you.
My name is Ed. I did a PhD at Trinity in drug design. But after that, I spent the last 25 years in healthcare in various roles. And now I run the Japan business for a UK biotech.
And just completed an undergrad degree in international relations. I'm going to add that.
It was just a hobby.
Just a hobby during COVID.
I'm Yasuhide. I'm working in Kyushu University, Fukuoka, and I'm just working in the mathematics department called Institute of Mathematics for Industry. Yes. I was in 1996. I was visiting fellow of Kumona at Trinity. I worked with Keith Moffat on fluid mechanics.
I'm Alan. I matriculated in 2012 and studied maths at Trinity, and now I'm in the physics department at Tokyo University of Science doing a research fellowship.
My name's Ivan. I graduated in 1991 from Trinity as a natural scientist, a chemist. Just before I graduated, I realized that I hated experiments. And so I changed my career. I became an English teacher in Spain and Japan. Came here 30 years ago. And in 1999, I joined Cambridge University Press, which is now Cambridge University Press and Assessment, and I'm head of regional marketing for the area that covers Japan and Korea through ASEAN down to Australia, New Zealand, Pacific.
And Ivan, at our previous dinner, Ivan gave us a talk on Japan and the English language, because Ivan is working for 30 years in the English language education industry in Japan. And so if you are interested about why the knowledge of English in Japan is what it is, you can listen to Ivan's, it's on YouTube. Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you.
And